Hello everyone and welcome to the channel, Ontario Law and the Older Person. This is going to be the first of a number of videos I'm going to be doing about older people and housing or lack thereof. This video I'm going to focus purely on rental housing, which is focusing on renting an apartment or renting a home, not about renting a room in a retirement home. We're going to be talking about that too in a later video. So unfortunately, usually when people talk about housing and affordable housing, they're talking about people being able to buy homes, which is something I find frustrating. So this video is purely about renting homes. The don't sue me warning. The information provided in this video is not legal advice. It is relayed for the purposes of general information. No legal decisions should be made based on this material. Any viewer who needs legal advice should contact a lawyer. So again, we're looking at the Human Rights Code. Under accommodation, section 2, subsection 1, every person has a right to equal treatment with respect to the occupancy of accommodation without discrimination because of race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, age, marital status, family status, disability, or the receipt of public assistance. And why do I emphasize this? When someone is seeking to rent accommodation, the landlord is not supposed to consider where they got the money from for their income. How are they paying the rent? So they're not supposed to say, I will not rent this space to you because you are on some form of public assistance like ODSP. And the reason the landlords don't want someone on ODSP is they recognize that it doesn't go up. The recipients don't get more money with the cost of living. So landlords are concerned that people on ODSP, for example, won't be able to pay increases in rent. And here we're going back to the website for the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and the title of this document, Policy Statement on the Duty to Accommodate under the Ontario Human Rights Code. Accommodation means making adjustments to policies, rules, requirements, and or the built environment to ensure that people with code-related needs have equal opportunities, access, and benefits. And by the way, this paragraph kind of slurs in all the different kinds of accommodation. So accommodation basically in the workplace, but also applies to actual accommodation when it comes to a residential property. Accommodation is a shared responsibility. Everyone involved, including the person asking for accommodation, should cooperate in the process, share relevant information, and jointly explore accommodation solutions. So, for example, a tenant who needs some kind of accommodation, there has to be like a discussion. What are the various possibilities? The tenant might not get exactly what they want. They have to be open to other options. Another page on the same website, Policy on Human Rights and Rental Housing. Directly from that page, housing is a human right. So again, housing is a human right. International law states that Canada must work towards making sure everyone has access to adequate and affordable housing. But some people, based on factors such as race, ancestry, disability, sex, family status, and social and economic status, do not receive the housing rights they are entitled to. When multiple factors intersect, the disadvantage increases and people are at even greater risk of discrimination, poverty, and even homelessness. Now, I want to point out something here. This list doesn't include age, and there's not much information about older people dealing with rental issues. So one of the things we need to focus on in this video is what are the implications for older people, and also to think about direct discrimination versus adverse effect discrimination. And this is an issue that I've addressed in other videos. So direct discrimination, flat out saying, oh, I don't want older people renting this accommodation, versus adverse effect, which is where something might be a neutral policy, a law that applies across the board, but this law might have a larger negative impact on a certain group of people who should be protected under the Human Rights Code or the Charter. So, are we looking at laws that have a harsher impact on people who are older? Because if yes, this is also a form of discrimination. And also, as a general question, so we have this international legal obligation. How are we doing with that? I would suspect very badly. Another quote: housing providers are not the only people responsible for making sure tenants' human rights are respected. Government legislatures, policymakers, planners, and program designers, tribunals, and courts must also make sure their activities, strategies, and decisions address discrimination in housing. And this is not about housing per se, it's a very sensitive topic I will be dealing with in another video with all the trigger warnings. But I know of a really horrific situation, and everyone across the board failed this person. The landlord, the organization that ran the housing, all the government agents that they tried to contact for help, and yet none of those people were held responsible for the terrible results of their refusal to do their duty. You can tell I'm really annoyed with it. More from that website: choosing tenants. A regulation to the code sets out what business practices are acceptable and what information can be used when choosing tenants. Rental history, credit references, and or credit checks may be requested. A lack of rental or credit history should not be viewed negatively. I can tell you two examples when it was. So back when I was a lawyer, I worked in family law, and this would have been like close to 20 years ago. I had a older lady who was my client, and she had had a traditional marriage. They'd been married for over 30 years. She never worked. She has never had a job. She was not on any of either the assets or debts. So her name wasn't on the mortgage, wasn't on the deed, no credit card in her name, no account in her name. Now she was getting a good amount of spousal support, but finding an apartment was very difficult for her because of this lack of history. And then another person you might not feel quite as sorry for. This was a person who had jumped off the grid, so left everything behind, living out in the middle of nowhere, and I suspect was working under the table. And he was trying to get someone to rent him a space, and he had nothing to show them. So might have the income, but maybe not willing to show them where the income was coming from. So that's not quite a clear-cut case, but it's a situation that can arise. Moving on. A landlord can ask for income information, but they must also ask for and consider together any available information on rental history, credit references, and credit checks, such as through Equifax Canada. Income information can only be considered on its own when no other information is made available. Income information should be limited to confirming that the person has enough income to cover the rent. So it's not the landlord's business whether they have more income than that. It is illegal for housing providers to apply a rent to income ratio, such as a 30% cutoff rule. I'm sure we've all heard the advice that you should not be spending more than 30% of your income on your housing, except we also know that for a lot of people, they blow past that percentage altogether, especially people of more limited means trying to pay rent. However, income information alone and rent to income ratios may be considered when tenants are applying for subsidized units where the rent amount is geared to income level. That makes sense. Housing providers can also ask for a guarantor to sign the lease, but only if the landlord has the same requirements for all tenants, not just for people identified by code grounds, such as recent immigrants or people receiving social assistance. Okay, but practically speaking, how can we know? If I go to rent an apartment and they say, oh, you need a guarantor, am I going to ask all the other tenants whether they said the same to all of them? And then, of course, what if someone doesn't have someone who can act as a guarantor? After all, the guarantor themselves have to give the impression, at least, that they can take over the rent if the tenant fails to pay. So, how does that work when someone doesn't have someone else that they can rely on? So, for example, older people, more and more of them are living lives of solitude. What if they don't have someone else who can do that for them? And then Regulation 290/98 under the code permits no other inquiries. We are going to take only the briefest look at this statute, Residential Tenancies Act 2006. This is the only thing we're going to look at under that statute. We're going to look at it with more depth in another video. So the category is called buildings, etc., not occupied on or before November 15, 2018. And this section is about exceptions to the regular rules when it comes to rents and how they are increased. So I'm not going to go into every word here. I'm just going to read out this little bit. So sections, bunch of sections, do not apply on and after the commencement date with respect to a rental unit if the requirements set out in one of the following paragraphs are met. I'm just going to read the first one. The rental unit is located in a building, mobile home park, or land lease community, and no part of the building, mobile home park, or land lease community was occupied for residential purposes on or before November 15, 2018. Okay, so buildings in use for residential purposes before November 15th and up to November 15, 2018, they have to follow guidelines with how much you can raise the rent for the same tenant. So you have a tenant, they've been there a year. So the idea is you're going to slide into one, like a monthly amount, and every year the landlord can increase the rent by a certain amount dictated by the government. So for 2026, that amount is 2.1%. So if you have someone who's living in the apartment, it's been a year, the landlord is allowed to increase the rent, but they are limited to an increase of 2.1% unless there's a huge capital investment and then they can increase it by more. But let's just stick with the 2.1%. However, November 16, 2018 and more recent, so that's the commencement date, there is no limit. So a tenant lives there a year, the landlord can increase the amount by any amount they want, even if they're still dealing with the same tenant. So that means people who are living in accommodations that started November 16, 2018 or more recently, they can't predict when how much they're going to have to pay next year. It's totally unpredictable. So for most people, that's a real financial hardship. For people who are reliant on a pension, it can be devastating. Now here's where it gets worse. Near the end of 2025, Premier Ford was putting out feelers with the idea of eliminating that previous situation. So basically taking away this kind of regulation from any rental accommodation. So anyone, they spend their year there, doesn't matter how old the building is, the landlord is allowed to increase this amount by whatever amount they want. That's the idea that Ford was floating end of 2025. He hasn't moved forward with that yet, and hopefully he doesn't, because it would be absolutely catastrophic. Anyone who would be renting would not be able to feel they had a home, because the next year the rent could be jacked up to an amount they can't pay for, and then they're done. They're kicked out. So this would contribute so much to homelessness, especially with those with a limited income, like, for example, someone reliant on CPP and old age security. So it would be really terrible if that happened. Hope it doesn't. This is a report, a qualitative look at serious legal problems of older adults in Ontario. So it covers a range of subjects. This is from 2024 by the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly. And I really recommend them as a great source of information. They have a website. They touch on a lot of different issues. Unfortunately, this particular report is no longer on that website. A genius decided it would be better off on a government site. So it's the government site that I will link in the description. A quote: throughout the summer and fall of 2023, we conducted a total of 26 individual interviews with older adults and facilitated 4 focus groups, comprising 1 group with older adults and 3 with seniors advocates. And I'm just pointing there. So 38 participants, not a huge sample, but it is what it is. Another quote: evictions. Participants frequently shared experiences of facing eviction, often highlighting challenges in accessing complaints processes during the COVID-19 pandemic. In one instance, a senior living in social housing struggled with online processes and would not have been able to attend their hearing without assistance from the local community center. Another person living in a rural area feared eviction if they raised concerns about rent hikes. Some sought assistance from community legal clinics to navigate their rights, emphasizing the desperate circumstances faced. The following quote demonstrates the desperation and need for affordable housing, and I skip that quote. But it's interesting that they fear being punished if they raised issue, which is a common theme when it comes to people being abused. They're afraid to report it because the abuse might get worse. Another quote, poor treatment by landlords. Several participants felt manipulated by landlords, reporting instances where they were asked to sign unfavorable agreements or face shorter notice periods to vacate. Landlords' non-compliance with the Residential Tenancy Act was a common theme, leading some to seek remedies through the Landlord and Tenant Board, though with limited satisfaction. Instances of intimidating behavior by superintendents and difficulties with the LTB process were emphasized, especially by seniors with low income, accessibility challenges, and technological barriers, as this participant noted. And then I skipped that bit. So one day I was dealing with the landlord tenant board, not usually part of my practice, but I was there for a day. And of course, I was stuck there listening to all these other cases showing up in front of the board. And so many of those cases were just flat out thrown out because the forms that the person filled out weren't perfectly filled out. Like I was astonished at the lack of flexibility by the person on the panel or on the board. Now, I don't know if this is one particularly mean spirited board member, but that's what was happening. It's not perfect, it's getting tossed. So, you're talking about people who have very little time to get their work together, to get access to resources, to get access to help. And then, they show up, their paperwork's not perfect, and it all gets thrown out. So, this is a problem. So here we have a little article that's from 2024 from the Tribunal Watch Ontario and LTB Statement of Concern. The numbers speak for themselves. So this is a quote. For tenant applications, Tribunals Ontario reports that the average wait time from filing to order is even longer, 427 days. And they're saying even longer than how long landlords have to wait. Okay. With some tenant applications, including applications seeking a maintenance order, taking over 2 years to be resolved. This can be compared to an average of 70 days for a tenant application to be resolved in a comparable period in 2018. And of course, we know that some of this delay has been caused by things being shut down for COVID. But so we have a situation, someone who's older, anyone really, getting evicted and trying to challenge the eviction, and they don't get in front of anyone who can make a decision for 427 days. Meanwhile, as we all know, the cost of rent is skyrocketing. So again, here we have a serious problem that's built right into the system and hurts the most people who do not have the access, the funds to rent new accommodation. This is a report from the Government of Canada, Solving the Housing Crisis, Canada's Housing Plan. And as I have put here, that's my phrasing, almost all of the attention in this document involves building houses and giving incentives to build rental accommodations. Very little is dedicated to tenants. And I, again and again, I say it all the time, every time I hear a discussion about, dealing with unaffordable housing, and then I go to that discussion and it's only about people being able to buy homes, kind of makes me want to scream. Anyways, here's a quote. Canada will create incentives to get builders building. We will encourage certain types of buildings like apartments or multiplexes to help reduce the cost of renting, free up space in the market, and create more opportunities for Canadians to save for a down payment on their first home. More from the same report. Launching a tenant protection fund. Direct quote. Renters face unique challenges to ensure their homes are properly maintained and that their landlords follow provincial laws. Tenant organizing and legal services can help renters face and overcome these challenges during tenancy difficulties because no renter should face these challenges alone. Renters can have a hard time navigating different provincial laws and lack resources to fight disputes with landlords, whether it concerns faulty heating, an illegal rent increase, or an illegal eviction. Another quote, To protect tenant rights and ensure that renting a home is fair, open, and transparent, Budget 2024 will propose a new $15 million tenant protection fund. This will provide funding to legal services and tenants' rights advocacy organizations to better protect tenants against unfairly rising rent payments, rent evictions, or bad landlords. And that fund has been created. They were looking for applicants in October 2024. I haven't seen material about how it's actually playing out. So if someone knows of such material, put it in the comments. I'll take a look. But as I mentioned, not a fan of Premier Ford. I have no trouble saying that. And as I said, he was floating the idea of eliminating any kind of rent control. And this, I'm saying this in 2026. He was pushing this in 2025. So how much of a real impact can this fund have if, say, the premier can throw out certain protections? And he's recently made some changes to the Resident Tenancies Act that a lot of people are very upset about. Also, some of these resources go to what happens if someone is illegitimately evicted. And as we've just seen, you could be waiting 2 years before you show up in front of the board. So people would need support during that 2 year period. Where are they going to live? So it's a pretty tense situation. I decided to end this video with a little bit of information from an online document, Landlord's Self-Help Center, a landlord's reference guide to human rights in rental housing. And what I'm focusing on here is a form of ageism that can take place in the ads that people use when they're looking for tenants. So for example, going to Kijiji, they're placing their ad, we want to rent this space to a tenant. And so these are phrases which discourage people who do not fit a profile. And they often include, so this is like the job ads that I talked about in another video. What is the phrasing in these ads? Do they show a preference? Are they meant to discourage people who do not fit the description? So here, ideal for quiet couple. And so what are people thinking when they think of a couple? They're usually thinking of someone in a romantic relationship, right? Not a couple of people, a couple. This is family status. This is something referring to one of the grounds that we looked at earlier in this video. Suitable for single, professional. So single, this is family status. Professional, they want someone whose income comes from a job, not from a pension. Perfect for female students. So first of all, we have female as a gender. Student, they're looking for someone of a particular age. Suits mature individual or couple. So again, mature, we're going for a particular age. And then individual or couple, so they're clearly not looking for families here. Great for working folks or students. So we have, again, working, source of income, students, implication for age. So they don't have to flat out say, we don't want X, but if they use language that encourages some to think, yep, that's my kind of place, and others to say, nope, they clearly don't want me, that can also represent a possible violation of the Human Rights Code. And then this document also gives these other examples. So samples of statements which openly discriminate include adult building, though there are exceptions to that idea. You know, some people, there are kinds of accommodations that are focused on seniors. So that's not a 100% sure thing. Must provide proof of employment, must have working income, no ODSP, seeking mature couple. So that's phrasing that could be considered a violation of the Human Rights Code. And it is interesting because if you were to go on Kijiji and look at ads for rental accommodation, when it's like a big business, they never refer to the tenant. They tell you how big the space is, what the other services are, how much it's going to cost. They don't talk about the tenant at all. It tends to be people who have renovated their basement, they're renting that out, and they're the ones who are saying, you know, these are the kinds of people we really want to have living here. So that can be problematic. If you go looking at ads and you see this, don't sue them based on my material. If you think someone's being discriminatory, then you need to contact a lawyer about that. Okay, so that's the end of this video. Thank you for getting to the end. If you're enjoying this kind of material, it would be great if you like and subscribe, and have a great day.